Hello, everyone. In this video, I will be showing you guys how to continue building out our platformer in Unity using visual scripting. And in particular, in this video, I'll be showing you guys how to set up a health system for your character with 3 hearts, and we'll be setting up the damage system. So we'll be getting started with that. We won't necessarily be implementing it with enemies yet, but we will be able to test it out. So I will start by sharing my screen. Okay, and we can jump right in. So the first thing we're going to want to do is select our player. Again, I'm in level 1. I'm going to select my player, and I'm going to add a new variable. And this is going to be my health variable. And again, like I showed you in a previous video, I can do this through the script graph menu by selecting my player in the hierarchy or scene view, going down to the blackboard, select object, and adding in a new variable here. Or with my player selected, I can go to the inspector and I can add a variable here. So I'm going to do this through the inspector. I'm just going to type in health and I'm going to hit the plus button. Again, we'll be able to see that it is adding down here as well. And this is going to be an integer value or an int. And this is going to be a value of 3 because our player will have 3 hearts. All right, so I'm going to apply this change to all instances of my prefab of my character. And now the next thing I'm going to do is actually jump over to my HUD scene. So I'm going to save. And what we're going to do in our HUD is we're actually going to be scripting the hearts in our row. So I'm going to, in my hierarchy, select my HUD. I'm going to drop that down and select my row. Remember, if I put my cursor over the scene window and hit F, I can focus in on that component. So from here, what I'm going to do is embed a script graph on this component. So what I'm going to do is hit add component. Again, I'm adding this to the actual row itself and not an individual heart. So I'm going to hit add component, and this is going to be a script machine. And this is going to be embedded. So I'm just going to change the source from graph to embed. And we can call this health UI graph. There we go. And I'll hit edit graph. And from here, I have my on start and on update function. So I'm going to maximize this by just double clicking in my window. There we go. I do not need the on start function. So I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to start with my on update. Now, this script is only going to be addressing the hearts, and we're going to be checking how many hearts the player currently has, and we're going to be showing an appropriate amount. So we'll be taking the health value as set in the player graph, and we'll be calling it here and checking for that integer or that number, and then applying a certain sprite for each of the 3 hearts that we have. So we'll start on our update or in our update with a for each loop. We'll just type in for each loop. And this is going to detect a list of objects. So I need to define my list of objects. And this is going to be a list of game objects. So we'll just choose list of game object literal. I'm going to add this plus sign, and I'm going to add 3 of these. I'm going to start with the top, and I'm going to type in heart, and I'm going to want heart 1 first, and then heart 2, and then heart 3 in that order. So now I have defined a list of hearts, and I have attached it to this for each loop. And now the body of this is going to link to an image set sprite. And we are going to be setting the sprite depending on each one of these items and depending on the value of our health. So I'm going to grab this index, and we're going to, not index, excuse me, item, and attach this to my target right here. So this is the image. Next, I am going to take my actual sprite right here in the image set sprite, and I'm going to choose a select option. And then from here, I'm going to choose a true and false value. This is going to be similar to how we set up the key. So if our value for heart 1 is 0, or if our health value matches our heart value, then we'll determine which sprites we're going to use. So if it doesn't match, or if we have 2 heart, 2 health, and we're looking at our third heart, we'll be giving it a false value. So what I'm going to do is sprite literal. I understand this is probably getting a little cumbersome and confusing, me trying to explain this. So I'll just show you. What I'm going to do is grab this sprite literal, and I'm going to choose my HUD heart empty. And then I'm just going to copy and paste this. I just need that sprite node. I'm going to attach that to the true. And for the true value, I'm actually going to be using heart full, HUD heart full. So again, similar to how we set up the key. Now I need a condition for this, which is going to be a Boolean value, as we can see up here in our graph inspector, and this is why I'm getting an error. So I'm going to actually look up the greater sign. I'm going to, it's over. I'm going to attach this B value to my index. So this is essentially saying my B value is going to be related to each one of these hearts. So this is technically 0, 1, and 2. Remember, Unity counts starting with 0. And then the A value is going to be a get variable. And this is an object variable. And you might know, or kind of have a clue where we're going with this. We're going to be looking at the health variable. And we're going to be getting the health variable from our player application. So we're going to get another variable, and this is going to be an application variable, and this is our player. And remember, we initialized our player variable or player application variable at the start of our player script graph. Okay, so essentially what this is doing is on update, remember this happens every frame that is going on in the game. For each of our hearts that we have here, we're checking our index value. And what I mean by that is we're checking our health value from our player. And if that is greater than our index value, which is 3, which is just the index is the number of items we have in our list. If this is equal to 3, then we will be showing up a full heart. So this is showing up as true. And this is what the sprite will render for each one of these hearts. So with that set up, now our hearts should relate in the HUD view. Now we just have to go set this up in our player script. So I'm going to Control S to save, and I'm going to go back to level 1. Okay, so now I'm going to choose my player. I'm going to hit F to focus in on them, just so I can see what I'm working on in here. And it doesn't make a big difference, but I like to be able to see my character. That way I can click on things in my scene view. Okay, from here, we're actually going to be adding something called a state graph. And we have not done a state graph yet, but state graphs work similarly to a script graph, but instead of a single kind of logic tree or kind of flow graph, a state graph can move between different states, as the name implies. So in our state graph, and the reason why we're using this instead of a script graph is because if our player's health reaches 0, then the player is going to be changing states. And so as we're changing between our health values as well, our player will be changing between states too. So whenever the player is hit, we want them to have a brief second of invulnerability. That way they're not taking damage after damage after damage when they've just barely touched an enemy. So we want to give the player at least a small grace period of 1 second where they have a brief moment of invulnerability. That way they aren't taking more damage than necessary. So to do this, we'll need to create a state machine. So I'm going to go to my macros. And actually, I can do this a couple different ways. I'll just go with my player selected. Go. I'll add component. And instead of a script graph, I'm going to type in state. I'm going to use a state machine. I've been saying graph, I mean machine. It's practically the same thing. Okay, so now I'm going to hit new. I'm going to go to my macros, and I'm going to call this player health. Okay, I have created a nice little macro here. So now I'm going to edit graph. And now you'll see that instead of an on start, on update, I just have this start, which has several functions nested in it: an on enter state, on exit state, and on update. So this is going to look a little bit different than what we're used to. I can, let's maximize this, and I can open this up, this start function, and we can take a look at what we have. So this might look pretty similar to what I was just saying, right? I have three states. I have an on enter, on update, and on exit state. Now, for this state, our start state as it's set up now, we're not going to be using either one of these functions. So I can delete these, and I will do that right now. We'll just hit delete. And since I'm in this particular state, you might wonder, how do I get back to my main overview? Well, again, if you look, I've mentioned this in a previous video, but if you look at the very top left of our script graph, next to these kind of icons, I have a player icon, and it has the state machine icon next to it. And then I have start, which has the script machine icon to it. So this is essentially your breadcrumbs. And if I hit player, you'll see that I go back to this kind of start node. Now, instead of my three icons that were underneath it, I just have the start node, and that's perfectly okay. Now, one thing I want to do before I get too far into the weeds of this is I'm just going to select this node, and I'm going to change the name of it. Instead of start, I want to call this vulnerable. So this is going to be a vulnerable state. This means the player can take damage. So I'm going to hit this start icon right here, and I'm just going to change this to vulnerable. There we go. And you'll see that the name on this node changes. I can add another node by right-clicking and create script state. And now I have a secondary script state, which, as you can tell, has the on enter, on exit, and on update functions. If I select it and go up to the top left, I can change the title of this too. And I'm going to call this invulnerable, if I can spell it. There we go. And so you'll see that this title changes as well. So we're going to have transitions. There's going to be a state where whenever I'm vulnerable, if I take damage, I'm going to be traveling to the invulnerable section for 1 second, and then I'll be traveling back to invulnerable to vulnerable. So I will make some transitions. We'll get to these shortly, but I'll just show you how to make them. All I have to do is right-click on a node, go to make transition, and then I'm just going to link this down here. And I'll do the same thing going from invulnerable to vulnerable. So right-click on this node, make transition, and select vulnerable. There we go. And so you can see the pathing of these transitions. So this transition is going from vulnerable to invulnerable by the arrow pointing down. This transition is going from invulnerable to vulnerable by the arrow pointing up. Okay, so to start this, what I'm going to do is jump back into my vulnerable section, or my vulnerable state, by double-clicking. And you'll see that I just have a blank graph right here. So what I'm going to start doing is start adding an event that subtracts the player's health whenever they take damage. So I'm going to start by right-clicking. I'm going to add a node, and I'm going to call it a custom event. And this is going to be similar to what we did with the death for the spikes, except we're going to call this damage. And we're going to give it an argument of 1. There we go. And you'll see that we have this kind of argument string here now. So this is going to go straight to a set variable. And this is going to be an object variable where we're adjusting the health. So if I hit this drop down, we'll see health because I've already set this up. Now we want to check what are our conditions for the set variable. I am going to be pulling the health value and subtracting an icon from it, or subtracting a number from it. So in argument 0 for our custom event, I'm actually going to pull this down and type in subtract. And you want to go with math generic. There we go. And I'm actually going to make this B. There we go. And now I'm going to take the A node and connect this to a get variable for object, get variable or get object variable, and this will be health. So I'm getting my health variable, and I am subtracting B, which is this damage, whatever we determine this damage to be. And we'll determine that whenever we're deciding what does damage to our player. And in this case, it will be our enemy, which we'll cover in the next video. Okay, so from here, this A minus B, this is going to link to a maximum inputs. We'll just do maximum in math/scalar. There we go. And for B, this is going to be a float. And a float literal of 0 value. Go. And we're going to link this up to our set variable object. Okay, so this effectively subtracts health from our player whenever damage occurs and whenever we trigger this damage event. So I'm just going to section this off and we'll call this subtract health from player. And now the next thing we're going to want to do is check to see if the player is dead. So if the player has lost all of their health, then we want them to go through the death state or the death event, which restarts the level, as you can recall from the spikes. So to do this, I'm going to take my set variable node. I'm going to drag its line to an if statement. And the condition for this if statement is checking for equality in our health versus a certain number. So I'm just going to look for the equal. And then I'm going to grab A back over here to our health icon or our health variable. And we'll compare our health variable to another integer value of 0. So we're going to call this check if dead. So if our health is equal to 0, then what do? Well, if health equals 0, if that's true, then our player is dead. So we need to trigger a custom event. We need to trigger this. And this event will be called death, which we've already determined and already said if death happens, and we're going to reload the current scene. And we can make a little icon, just say if dead. Now, if health does not equal 0, if health equals 0 is false, so if the player still has life, then they are not dead. And so we're going to use our animator to trigger a event. Set trigger. There we go. And we just need the name. We're going to trigger an animation called hurt. And this animation is already set up. We're not going to be setting up any animations or anything like that. We're just scripting them or coding them in. So what we'll do is trigger our hurt animation, and we will trigger a hurt event. So again, another custom event, and this should be a trigger. And we'll just call hurt again. And we'll section this off and called if not dead. Okay. So we have our first state, and this is our vulnerable state, or essentially our living state. If our player is alive and vulnerable, then we have a chance to subtract health from the player. If the player will, once we subtract health, we'll check if the player is dead or not. If they are dead, we will restart the level through this custom death event right here. And if they are not dead, then we'll just send them to the hurt animation, and we'll trigger the hurt event, which will take off a point of health for the player. Okay, so from here, I'm going to back out. And remember, I can follow the breadcrumbs at the top right. I'm invulnerable, so I need to go back to player. And the next thing I want to do is determine what does my invulnerable state look like. So I'm going to go into my invulnerable. Notice how it's grayed out, so nothing is set up yet. So if I open this up, I have on enter, on update, and on exit. I'm only going to be using on enter and on exit, so I can get rid of my update. And when I enter this state, I want my player to not take any damage. Now, in order to make this work, we're going to be using something called layers. We've talked about this a little bit, just briefly in the some of the earlier videos, but layers work similar to tags, except this is just another way to classify items in your scene and in your game. So what we'll be doing is when we enter this state, when we enter the invulnerable or invincible state, we're going to be changing the layer that the player character is on. And we're going to be turning off the interaction between that layer and the enemy layer. So when the player is in this new state, they're in a different layer that does not collide with the enemy, which means they cannot take damage. So what we'll do is from on enter state, we'll go to game object and set layer. And then this little node right here for our condition or our value, we'll be taking that and going to a layer mask and name to layer. And now we're going to name the layer that we're going to want this player to move to whenever they are in the invincible state. So we're going to call this player invincible. And it's important that you spell these exactly as they are spelled in your layers, or else it will not work. And I'm going to section this off, and we'll just call this set invincible layer on state enter. And we'll just set to invincible layer, and I'm going to copy this. Okay, so whenever the player leaves, we want them to go back to their original layer, which in this case will be the player layer. So what I can do is really just copy and paste this. Oh, there you go. Control C, Control V, Command C, Command V on a Mac. And then I'm just going to connect these two nodes. And instead of player invincible, this is just going to be called player. There we go. And so I can node this up and set to player layer when leaving state. There we go. So that's it for our invulnerable state. Now, one thing we need to do is double check that to see that we actually have these layers. If we're scripting these layers and calling them in our code, but we don't have the layers, this code will not work. Now, right now, we're not going to be doing enemies, so we can't necessarily test this, but what I can do is when I leave my full screen to script graph and go back to my full edit menu or edit mode, I can look in the inspector and I can drop down, or I see this layer option just like I see tags. And if I drop down this layer, I can see which layers I have. Now, currently, I don't have a player or player invincible layer. So I'm going to need to add some layers in here. You'll need to do this as well. So what I'm going to do is hit this add layer button. And you'll see that I have this long list of layers. I've already added platform on here, and I've added my platforms to these layers. But now I'm going to add several other layers that we'll be using throughout the rest of this tutorial. So I'm just going to layer 7. You can do these any way you want. I like to leave layer 3 open in case I want to put something else up there closer that's kind of becomes more important. But I'm just going to start with layer 7. I'm going to add a player layer. Remember, we need that one. We'll need a player invincible layer. And make sure you spell these exactly how they're spelled in here. Right? I know in the future that I will also need a projectiles layer. And I'm going to need enemies. I'm going to add in those 4. So player invincible, projectiles, enemies. We added platform in one of the earlier videos. You can also add in background, and that can be helpful. We won't necessarily be scripting it, but this is just another great way to kind of organize your information. So with that being done, I can select my player again, and I should be fine. And this state should be good to go. So I'm going to go back into full screen over here, and then I'm going to go back to my player state. So again, following my breadcrumbs, we'll hit player state. Now I see that my invulnerable state is still kind of grayed out, but I need to set up my transitions next. So what I'm going to want to do is just click in this first transition, and I'm going to add a little kind of like section or code for here. All I have to do is add one node. It's going to be a custom event. And this is going to be just a regular custom event. And we're going to call hurt. And we're going to tie this up to trigger transition. So what this is effectively saying, and I'll back out in a second, but we've already determined and created a custom event called hurt. So whenever hurt happens, that's when we want to move from vulnerable down to invulnerable. So now that I have this first transition set up, now I see that my vulnerable is gray, or it's in color, or it's saturated. So I know that this is working. Now my transition from invulnerable to vulnerable is not working. So we need to go over there and check that one out as well. So we'll click on here. Now for this state, I want my player to wait 1 second before they move to the back into the vulnerable state, before they can get hurt again. So what I'm going to do is right click. Now I'm going to type in on enter state. And from here, I'm going to go to wait 4 seconds, FOR. And the delay is going to set to 1. So this means that for 1 second after my player has entered the invulnerable state, I'm going to wait, and then I'm going to go back to my other state. So it's as simple as that. Now, there's one other thing that we need to do. On this on enter state, if I select this, I need to look up in my graph inspector, and you need to check this coroutine box. So that's important. Just make sure you make this a coroutine. Okay, so if I go back up to my player state machine, now I see all my nodes are highlighted and they are all colored and filled. So now I should be able to make this work. This should be functioning. So let's test. Again, I don't have an enemy set up in here, so I can't really test it with an enemy. If I test it with my spikes, they are going to kill my player. So let's play. I won't necessarily be able to check the invulnerable state yet, but I can check to see if my health works with my HUD. Okay, so I can move around, I can jump. My vulnerable state is blue, so that means I'm currently in that state. I have my health set to here for 3 integers. Now let's go to our health value, and let's type in 2. All right, I typed in 2, and we can see that I have 2 hearts being displayed. Let's type in a value of 1. All right, now I have 1 heart being displayed. Now let's type in a value of 0. And I have no hearts. Now I'm not dead yet, right? Because I'm manually entering these numbers. Now let's try again. We'll put in a value of 3, and I have all 3 hearts. So at this stage, this is about as much testing as we can do on this. But in the next video, we'll be covering the enemy AI. It will be pretty comprehensive, and that's where we'll kind of do the final testing for our health and damage. So that covers health and damage for this video. Good luck and have fun.